Microsoft are enhanced online.
Okay, I will call this budget meeting to order. And I will start by going over the committee's responsibilities, roles, and processes. So the role of the budget committee is to receive the budget message and the budget documents, to review the proposed budget, and to listen to comments from citizens. The action that the budget committee will take is to approve the budget and set the tax rate. So to meet that legal requirement to pass a budget for next year, this committee has some specific roles and actions that I will go over briefly. So the role of the budget committee is to receive the budget message and the budget documents from the superintendent and to review the proposed budget. And the budget committee is the means for the public to participate in the budgeting process. The public is encouraged to participate because one of the most important purposes of the committee is to take comments and questions from interested citizens. So there are two actions that the budget that are required for the budget committee, and that is that the committee will approve the budget at the major fund and function level and will set the tax rate. The budget committee does not approve new personnel, set salaries, benefits, or contract terms for employees or administrators. It is also outside the committee's scope of work to set staffing levels or decide whether or not a service or program should be provided. The budget committee does not make district policies, and the budget committee's work is complete after it has approved a proposed budget. Once the budget committee refers the budget to the school board will then hold a public hearing and adopt the budget. So that is what we are here for today. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Superintendent Cordy.
Thank you, Chair Brutowski. This evening, we are happy to share with you the budget message for the 2021-22 school year. It is included in your packet, and there is a printout of that budget message in front of each of you. That budget message details the following topics: the economic and revenue forecast, the state school fund, the legislative response, state and federal grants that we are receiving, enrollment, and what we'll be building our budget on, key assumptions, and some information about our reserves. So rather than taking the time to read that, it's in front of you and has been included, as I said, in the board packet. So with that, I'll hand off our presentation to Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Superintendent Cordy, Chair Allen, Chair Brutowski, members of the Budget Committee. Appreciate your time tonight. This has been a, whoops, excuse me. You know, the tech guy can't remember to turn on the tech. Sorry about that. We'll bring up the slide deck here in one moment. In the meantime, this really has been a year like no other, and the state legislature convened remotely. We did not see traditional recommendations for the state school fund amounts, and frankly, our enrollment systems were really not designed to accommodate a worldwide pandemic. Federal and state resources to assist were made available. However, they did not impact all schools across Oregon equally. And the distribution method of those resources means Sherwood has a different set of choices than maybe some of our peers with similar sized enrollments. And however, we may not see it in this particular state school fund and the budget cycle we're talking about now. The recent economic and revenue forecast indicates that there might be a brighter future ahead. So here are the topics we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. And of course, please feel free to ask questions as we move along. At any point, just raise your hand. So starting with our economic revenue forecast, which came out here just 2 weeks ago on May 19th, economists provided an update on the Oregon economy and expected revenue. They revised expectations in the current biennium, which ends June 30th, and updated the projections for the next biennium, which is for the 2 years beginning July 1. For the current biennium, the one we finished this month, the key points were that the state will receive $1 billion more than in the last forecast in March. And this gives the state $4.2 billion in reserves, or roughly 18% of the general fund. For the next biennium, It's roughly $2.2 billion higher than the March forecast, and that includes the $1 billion in additional carryover from 2019 and 20. Another key update in the economic forecast was for the corporate activity tax. This is the tax that funds the Student Success Act, and the estimate was up $76 million from March to $2.36 billion in the next biennium. Our partners at COSA, I'm going to call it the wrong name because I've called it the Confederation of Oregon School Administrators for 40 years. That group is estimating that we will see an additional $35 million to the student investment account in 21-23, and that number will get to the student investment account in a few minutes. But roughly for every $1 million that goes into the SIA account, our district gets about $8,000. So it's similar to our ADM distribution formula, and so as we're moving through those numbers, you can kind of keep that in mind. The other news from the revenue forecast is that the income tax kickers will kick. The personal income tax is over $1 billion, which goes back to all of us taxpayers. The corporate income tax, which the kicker will be about $640 million, is dedicated to K-12. However, it's dedicated in such a way that the state can offset, or the legislature can choose to offset some in the state school fund with that money. And so it's not necessarily an increase to education as a whole. So there's really two reasons why the state has an improved economic forecast. First, just the unprecedented amount of federal aid has boosted, it's actually outstripped the economic losses, and as a result, it's increased personal income across state of Oregon despite the job losses. And then the loss of revenue associated with sharp declines in a typical recession hasn't happened this time, and so we have additional resources coming in. Looking forward to the 21-23 biennium, the increasingly positive outlook suggests that healthy tax collections will continue, and they're calling for near-term growth that is, frankly, on some of the strongest we've seen in many decades. So the state school fund is actually the pot of money that we receive our funding from. The current biennium that we're just ending, there was $9 billion put into the state school fund. The next biennium, the governor and the co-chair's budget framework came in at 9.1. And then as we talked about at our orientation meeting just that week, the Ways and Means Committee had bumped that to 9.3. And since that meeting, the Senate has approved that number as well. So we're feeling pretty good about the 9.3 number. And in fact, that's what we're building our budget on. So while the 9.3 is definitely higher than the last biennium, which is appreciated, our statewide partners, including COSA and OSBA, have suggested that to maintain current service levels, we really need 9.6. And current service levels just means that we'll keep the programs and staff that we have, and with the roll-up cost, be able to continue those. Oh, that's right. The legislature has about 4 weeks left, and so we're very hopeful that they will get the opportunity and find the way to bump that 9.3 to 9.4 or even further. Any amount that we get above the 9.3 helps our budget. Every $100 million of state funds in the state school fund is about $800,000 to our district. So important for us that we reach that 9.6. We have a few state and federal grants that are currently available to us. The Student Investment Account and the Measure 98, both of those are state, they're basically state law, and so it's ongoing funding that we're able to utilize. The state summer learning grants and also the federal elementary and secondary schools emergency relief funds, those are one-time funds that have kind of a limited lifetime in which we can actually utilize those. And Gary is going to talk to you a bit about the Student Investment Account and the Summer Learning Program.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Good evening, Chair Bertowski, Chair Allen, Dr. Cordy, members of the Budget Committee. So some exciting news in state and federal grants funds. The student investment account, you might remember that last year we had some pretty sizable investments we were talking about to the tune of $3.9 million. Right when we presented this to the board and right before the schools closed in March of last year. And it was really an exciting time in education, sort of once in a generation really type of investments. And right out of the gate, schools closed, the economy crashed. The pandemic reduced the collections of that corporate activities tax to $1.2 million, not 1.2 million, but the equivalent to Sherwood of 1.2 million, down from our original estimate of 3.9 million. So that was a fairly big hit to us. But the great news was there was actually a real silver lining there, is most districts ended up using about a third of their student investment account funds to backfill their budgets, and investing in things that were allowed by the act. This was something that ODE and the state allowed us to do. And so the nice thing was the amount that we still had remaining in funds, even after the pandemic, allowed us to hold all those key positions we already had in place. And we just simply didn't make our new investments, or very many of our new investments. Fast forward to 21-22, our estimated amount of receipts from the student investment account is just over $3 million for next year. So that will allow us to make nearly $1.8 million in new investments next year. Really good news, super exciting stuff. I'll detail out those in a couple minutes in the next couple slides. And those are largely focusing on increasing achievement for all kids while decreasing disparities in achievement, mental health of the kids, and then just offering a well-rounded education. Those were the areas of the act called out that we needed to stay focused on and invest in. We also have another pot of money that sort of sits with Measure 98 and with the student investment account in a nice way. It's Measure 98, or the High School Success Act. This was passed by voters about 5 years ago. And it focuses on, you can see those three areas up there: dropout prevention, CTE, and college level opportunities. Next year, our grant is estimated to be just over $1.35 million. That's slightly more than we had in 2021. So that's good news. And when we invested last year's money, we invested some money in capital equipment at the high school around CTE. When we opened the new high school, we bought some state-of-the-art equipment with us. Those were one-time expenditures. And so the estimated grant of 1.35 million allows us to maintain all the existing personnel investments we had, which are ongoing, and make about $185,000 in new investments for next year going forward. And those are sort of blended with the SIA investments. The thing about the High School Success Act is we can spend a little bit of the money on 8th grade. So for example, one of the positions we hired in middle school, we paid 2/3 out of the student investment account and 1/3 out of Measure 98. And that's allowed and encouraged by the state to blend those funds together to make good decisions for the district. So going through, just quickly through our investments, we're hiring 4 elementary STEM specialists. You might recall we went through a bond process and built some new schools, built a new school, opened some elementary schools. We have maker spaces in all those elementary schools. And those are places where kids can get in and design stuff, engineer stuff, do some really cool stuff. And we're hiring some STEM specialists to staff those and to build that program. Elementary music and PE teachers to make sure we get a good rounded education. Investing in some class size reduction at our Title I school, which is Hawksview. We're only putting 1 teacher to that. We'd originally planned on doing more to that, but with the reduction in the funds, that's what we're able to do this year. An associate principal at the Ridges, which is really the size of 2 campuses and has a large enrollment. And so just to make sure we're able to manage the whole property, manage kids, supervise staff, all those kinds of things, we're hiring an associate principal there. And we're hiring another instructional assistant for our behavior team, which has been a really valuable team, which helps with kids who are struggling to manage their behavior at young ages, primarily at young ages. At the middle school, you'll see some of these are similar. Whoops. So we're missing a middle school slide. I know most of those investments off the top of my head, so I'll try to get them just right. We're hiring, just as in you see on the high school investments listed here, we're hiring a licensed mental health specialist and AVID elective teachers. AVID is a program. So we'll go back to the start on the middle school. So Not sure why we're missing a slide here. Sorry for the folks at home. Sorry, Budget Committee. I'll take my time and detail these out so they're clearly in the record. In the middle school, we're hiring a math coach. This is to help focus on math instruction, math interventions. We're hiring a licensed mental health specialist. One of the challenges that we've seen with our students across the state, and even more so coming out of a pandemic, is mental health. And so by hiring someone on site to provide services to our kids and direct them to wrap around mental health services, we think that'll make a huge difference in a lot of our kids who are really struggling in school. We're hiring an intervention specialist. This specialist will serve to provide reading interventions to students who struggle with reading by providing very targeted support. That's something we haven't had the funding for in a long time. And when you are struggling to read, you're struggling to learn a lot in middle school. So we think that's a really important position for us. To go along with the licensed mental health staff, we're hiring a rest and return room specialist. And so that will be a classified staff member that will staff a room where students who are struggling will be able to go gather themselves, get some support, and go back to class as needed. One thing you'll see on the high school list in front of you is a multi-tiered system of supports, TOSA. So TOSA stands for Teacher on Special Assignment. And a multi-tiered system of support is really our overarching strategy for the Student Success Act and the Student Investment Account. And a multi-tiered system of support is really a strategy that's steeped in research. It's based in evidence. It's one of the strategies that provides the highest leverage for the time you spend in terms of increasing achievement for all kids. And really what it does is it focuses on tiers of instruction. So all students would get access to tier 1 supports, which are mental health supports, academic supports, behavior supports that all kids would get. Then there's tier 2 supports, and some kids need what's in tier 1 and a little bit of tier 2. And some kids need tier 1, tier 2, and then really intensive supports in tier 3. So that intervention specialist I mentioned ago, that would be a tier 3 support for students who are really struggling in reading. And so that's how all that fits together. And then we're hiring some avid elective teachers. Yes, Director Adamson.
Yeah, Gary, I think not everyone here and not maybe everyone watching at home was able to see the presentation at the board meeting a week ago that included data around multi-tier, the MTSS specialists. Am I right in remembering that the data shows that just by implementing that system and making those supports available, you can take a kid who is, that is not achieving grade level achievement and move them not just a year like they need to, but a year and a third or a year and a half within a single year by utilizing the system, that's the efficacy level that we're talking about here.
That is correct. And it's not just that one student, it's students on an average in this moving a year and a third. And the students who need more will most likely move more than that because they're getting the most intensive supports. It's really about an efficiency of deploying resources. And one of the best known educational researchers, his name's John Hattie, highly respected. And he essentially does meta-analyses of meta-analyses. He looks at really high level research. And of the 252 strategies, he studied 250 plus strategies, I'll say, because this list is always being added to. And so in his list of over 250 strategies, this was the 5th most effective strategy that people can employ. And so when we're adding new positions in the student investment account and in Measure 98, we're building out some of those interventions. And this multi-tiered system of support is really an efficient way of deploying not only those new resources, but also the existing resources in the district. Thank you for that question. The last thing we're adding in middle school are AVID elective teachers. AVID is a program that focuses on a lot of things. One, it focuses on quality instruction school-wide and some systems school-wide, which are have some really strong evidence base behind them. And it also focuses on first-generation college-going students. And so those students will have the opportunity to take that as an elective course, and it does everything from college visits at a young age to helping them all the way through high school, all the way through graduation and into college. And so it's a really important program, really does great things for our kids. And so we're investing in that at the middle school. At the high school, you can see the first 3 bullet points on the high school list. Similar to the middle school, the licensed mental health specialist will be 1 at the middle school, 1 at the high school. The multi-tiered system of supports, TOSA, that will be 1 person working 6/12, building a cohesive system. So it's half time at the middle school, half time at the high school. And again, you see the Avid elective teachers on there. A couple of other things. We have a great partnership with Washington County. And so they pay half the salary of a drug and alcohol counselor who is in our high school full time. And that's been a huge support for not only our kids who struggle with potentially substance abuse, but also kids who have family members who struggle, and just trying to navigate all of those challenges. It's been really helpful to our kids, and she's made a huge impact on a lot of our kids. We're hiring an Avid coach and coordinator. That'll be focused on one of the key premises of Avid is on instructional strategies and bringing some cohesive instructional strategies to a school system. And so this person will work on rolling those out and also being the site coordinator for the program, which is a fairly big lift. And then a graduation coach / campus monitor. We already have one of those in place. Wasn't enough of the old high school, certainly not enough at the new high school. And for people who don't know sort of the role of a campus monitor, they're the ones out with the kids, building relationships, getting to know the kids. It's as much about relationship building as it is about supervision. And a lot of times those are the ones who are like, I didn't see you yesterday. Where were you? That accountability for coming to school. Did you get your project in yesterday? And then they do technical work of helping the kids as well. But it's both of those situations, and that's why the two work together. The last set of investments are at the district level. In our original SIA plan, we'd proposed hiring a mental health director for the district, which is an administrative position. With our, as we've talked about it more, and with new special program staff, we've turned that into a mental health teacher on special assignment. We feel like that will be the right level to do the work we need them to do, especially with the 2 licensed mental health specialists at the middle and high school level and a school psychologist we hired last year at the elementary level. Some extended release time for instructional assistants to collaborate, our special ed instructional assistants. And one thing that happens in school systems is our instructional assistants, they are working with students from the second they walk in the door, for the most part, maybe not all of them, but most of them, till the second they walk out of the door. And that time to sit down with the special ed teacher or with the team of teachers and say, here's what's working, here's what's not working, let's recreate the plan. Doesn't cost very much money. You're talking $35,000, I think, what we put to this, but high leverage use of those funds, little investment, big impact. And then we expanded our family liaison, also a big impact with very little expense. And so that is a summary of our investments. I'd take any questions you have about those investments, and then I'll move on to the summer term slide.
Yeah, just one question. So this is based off of the 9.3 or the 9.6?
So that's a good question. There's a couple points I should probably add to this. So this is a separate, I'm going to go back a couple slides here. So what we're talking about now is funded. So there's the 9.3, and that's our general fund money. And these are grants on top of that money that have to be invested in very specific things. So we have leeway over how we spend them, but we have to spend them in certain categories. And so all of these investments we just talked about come from this student investment account and the Measure 98 High School Success Act. Does that clarify? Other
I
questions?
think Director Allen has a question.
Just a quick comment. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that instructional assistants are working with the kids from the time they hit the crosswalk, not the time they hit the school.
Yeah, before the kids even arrive in school, they're with students. That's exactly right. They're doing crosswalk duty, all kinds of things, and they are always on. And so to have time for them to just slow down and collaborate, really important. The other thing that I mentioned in the other board meeting where we talked more in depth about this is these investments that are coming out here. These arose out of our community engagement process that we undertook in the fall of last year. We spent most of last year engaging the community, surveying the community, doing focus groups, several different events. And so I took a plan to the board. The plan was approved by the board. And these investments come directly from that. We're not making all of the investments we made before because we have less money, but I just wanted to point out for the budget committee and for folks at home that is where these originate from.
That's one quick question on, so for this year, this is what we can fund, but how many of these positions are tied to this funding level going forward in subsequent years? So if that goes down in the future, does that mean some of these positions would possibly go away?
Or we would have to find another way to fund them. That's correct. And the The corporate activities tax, the good news is expected to continue to expand based on the forecast we know. And so I think there's probably, if that forecast holds, there's probably room there and we may be able to even make some more investments. I mean, that's speculative. I don't know the answer to that. Major 98 is $800 per high school student. So you have to be a little bit more careful with the Major 98 money, because if you find yourself in a declining enrollment situation or even flat enrollment, your revenue stays the same and your costs could potentially will increase just due to insurance costs and cost of living and things of that nature. So we have to have contingency plans and watch for that.
Just a real quick comment. So the things that we're going over, the Student Success Act, that was money approved by the legislature, and Measure 98 was obviously through the voters at the ballot box. These are things that parents have provided for the schools and have supported for the schools. And you can see the benefit that it is bringing to our kids in Sherwood. And going forward as parents, we need to just keep doing this, because we can't let this investment decline. We have to keep it moving forward.
Thank you. This investment will make a huge difference for kids. The last piece is the summer learning grants, and a sizable amount of money. The legislature appropriated $250 million for summer learning grants. So there's broken into a couple of different sections here, each with a slightly different requirements. The K-8 program is about enrichment. It's pretty open-ended in terms of what we can do with that. It's really about bringing kids into school, getting them engaged with other kids, letting them have a good time, building some skills by doing some reading and some math. But it also includes art and ceramics and whatever else we can include. And so that's wide open. And that's for grades K through 8. And the state gave us $722,000 for that. And we have to match 25%. So that's $241,000 in matching. And that can come from a variety of sources. The high school grant for grades 9 through 12 is more specific. It's about credit recovery and for about getting kids back on track who were adversely impacted by the pandemic and are needing credits to catch up in order to graduate. And there's a significant amount of money for that as well. And so we're focused on building out both of those programs, and that's going pretty well, and we're pretty excited about that. There's also a grant for wraparound childcare for students who qualify under Title I. And so they can attend for grades K through 5, they can attend our summer learning program from 8 to noon, but then they can go to childcare paid for by the district for the rest of the day, so that the parents' work schedule doesn't get in the way of them being able to attend this programming. And so we're working on getting that set up as well. So really exciting stuff, huge opportunity for our kids. It is one-time money, so this is not something we'll be able to repeat every year. And it was done in response to the pandemic. Any questions before I pass it back to Mr. Rose?
I would just quickly comment, though, that when we think about this not being one-time money, this topic was also high on the board's list collectively back 2 years ago when we were talking about what are the investments that we can make to prevent as much loss as we see over the summer. So I think just a comment to folks going forward that as and if resources become available, I think trying to continue to do this sort of work is really important.
For sure. The summer slide is well noted in the research as being one of the major drivers of disparities in achievement, for sure. Okay, thank you very much.
So we covered the federal ESSER grants a bit at the orientation. ESSER stands for the Elementary and Secondary Schools Emergency Relief Act. And we have about $1.7 million coming in from the feds, and that is intended to help cover costs due to COVID. There is some timelines, as you can see, about how long we have to spend those dollars, but again, they're one-time dollars, and we will take kind of maximum advantage of those as we move forward. I want to talk a little bit about our enrollment to date. We started this year on October 1, which is the key date for us because that's when we report to ODE how many students we have, at 4,627 students. We've had some adjustments across the different levels, but we sit at 4,631. So we've grown a little bit, and that's actually good news because we typically see a decline throughout the year. Keep in mind, these numbers are 400 students less than we were a year ago. Most of that coming in the early grades at the elementary level, a little bit at middle school, and then the high school actually was right where we projected. So we do expect these numbers to kind of come back as we make sure people know that we're going to be open in the fall as normal as we possibly can. And so we expect students who might have departed to take the opportunity to come back and join us. We are reaching out to those families that left through email and making sure they understand that we have the Synergy online registration, which they can reach from our homepage on the website to make sure that they're signing up early. We want them to sign up early so we can track those numbers and make sure that we can accommodate any changes in student population. So let's talk a little about our key assumption and what does this mean for all of our budget. We, as we mentioned earlier, are building our budget on a state school fund number of $9.3 billion and an enrollment number of 4,859. That 4,859 is halfway between our enrollment number this year and the original projection from Davis Demographics, the company that helps us make these projections, pre-pandemic. And so that's the key for us, is that 4,859. On the expenditure side, our assumptions include a cost of living adjustment for staff at 2.25%, medical insurance increase at 3%. These are pretty typical numbers that we've had in the past. And then we do actually get to benefit the next biennium from new PERS rates that are 3% lower. So that's fantastic news. And then we also have 11 positions that we will not be filling. Now, 6 of those are from the cloud campus, and we're needed to make sure that as we launch the cloud campus, we didn't break up classrooms and so forth as we had kids coming back into the buildings. And so we had to have enough teachers to accommodate that. And then we also have 5 positions that are open through attrition, mostly retirements. So as you know, one of our goals is to maintain a 10% reserve on our budget. Those reserves help lessen the impact of financial downturns or decreases in enrollment. 10% has been hard to achieve the last number of years, and so we've been looking at really a 5%, and that's what the two gray arrows on your left represent, 10% and 5%. The 10% requires $5.6 million in reserves, and the 5% is about 2.8. And this slide represents the estimates at June 30th of this year, so in just a few weeks, on that left column, the blue column. And then it's the projections for the next 2 years. This is, again, with the 9.3 billion. We also added the ESSER dollars. That's the kind of copper color or orange color you see there, as that will be used to help offset our ending fund balance decreases. The number on the left you'll see is right there at the 10%, and that's a big improvement over our projection from last year when we thought we'd have about 3.3 million in reserves, or roughly 5.8%. So we are about 4% ahead of our expected ending reserves for this year. And this isn't due in part to not having to need as many substitutes. We paid less overtime. We had changes in spending patterns, transportation savings, and then a large refund from an overcharge on water service from the city of Sherwood. This takes us to just over the $6 million and that 10% target. However, even here at the 9.3, you can see just next year, we start to cut into those ending reserves. We'd be at about 9.2 million next year, and the following year, or excuse me, 9.2% next year, and the following year at about 4.8. The column on the right,
I think we have a question.
Okay. Just very quickly, the column on the right is for that second year of the biennium. And one of the questions has come up is what number are we using for ADM in that year? We are actually using 4,899, so 40 students higher than what we're using for this year. And that is because we took the Davis demographic projection, pre-pandemic, looked at how many they expected us to grow in that year, and we decided half was an appropriate amount. So we added 40 students instead of the 80 that they projected 2 years ago. And so that's how we get to the 4899 students in that year. Jessica?
Thank you. That was exactly the question I was going to ask, because I think if you look at this graph against the current economic projection that we're in for a period of some pretty outstanding growth as an economy, like what on earth is going on, that we also see reserves going down. And I think that this is based in large part upon a lack of a enrollment projection that takes into account a global pandemic. So depending on what our numbers look like when we get to October, and we're at that October 1 date, we could see the second year of this looking very different based upon how much money comes in on a per student basis through ADM, as opposed to looking at a projection where we go from over 10% to nearly half of that in just the course of a biennium. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Our budget is completely contingent on how many students we have show up. And that's why we try very hard over the years to make sure that number is as accurate as we can get. And this year's just really interesting to try to make that projection. I feel really good about the kind of the methodology we've decided to use, and I'm very hopeful, and we are watching weekly what the registration numbers are looking like. So I'm feeling good about our projection. It's that question of how many of those students are going to come back that chose other opportunities this last year. Ryan.
Yeah, so you said this was based off of the 9.3.
Yes.
And so if it does go to 9.6, does that excess money go into the reserve?
That is a fantastic segue
Oh, nice.
to the next slide, which is the 9.6. It is laid out the same way. You've got the same arrows of 10% and 5%. It looks better. Year two, we'd have about 11%, or excuse me, the first year of the biennium, this next year we're going into, we'd have about 11% in ending reserves, followed by 8.8. So even at 9.6, we start cutting into our reserves in that second year. So,
Sorry, just one more question. So you said the headcount forecast for next year was 40 heads higher than this year.
yes.
And then when do we get back to what we would say was we lost 400 this year. When do we get back to that? Is it 2 or 3, 4 years down the road?
That's a fantastic question, and we just don't have a solid answer.
Okay.
Some of those families may have decided to go to online schools. They may have gone to private schools. Whether or not they choose to come back, we're not going to know really until they register. I do believe we're going to see a fair amount of growth. And we also know that we have some housing coming online across the city. Small pockets right now, but with Brookman Road and others that will be in a little bit further out, distant future. I think we will see some growth, but how and when those 400, if all 400 come back, we're not entirely sure. So
Just continuing that theme, if we can we're at 9, this is based on 9.3, and these are the numbers for 9.6. If we can only get to 9.4, anything is going to help our reserve picture. And that's really important for us to have those reserves when a downturn does come, because it limits the amount of cutting that we have to do. And that this is completely up to parent support. So I say this all the time, but as parents, we have to be talking to our representatives in Salem to support education. And and now's the time to do it. We got 4 weeks left. We should at least get the 9.4. But we won't do it without the parents.
Roger, did I see you reach for the button?
Yes, thank you. So for our headcount estimates, how much can that estimate, the actual, fluctuate from the estimate before it becomes a problem one way or the other? I would assume that relatively small changes can be accommodated fairly easily, but significant changes when staffing levels are set and most hiring is done could become problematic. What level does that become a problem?
We haven't traditionally had a set level at which we make certain decisions. Our process has been that as we have those kinds of years, that we start looking at it. First, it comes a little bit out of the ending reserves, and then really we start accommodating for the second year. We're fortunate in that the way the state does their ADM distributions, the way they divide the money, you as a district get to choose between your hire of the year you're in or the previous year. And so a 1 year drop, while it can be problematic, it gives you that time to adjust before you have to start making those decisions. So this year, where we had 400 students less than last year, we get to use last year's number. And so that kept us from having to immediately go out and make significant cuts, because 400 students is a large drop. And that's why we're very hopeful that we bounce back and expect to bounce back, because then we can pick that next year's number, which will be roughly 250 higher than this year. So we actually have a little bit of time to adjust. So, Jessica?
But yeah, I'm kind of building on what Roger's question is, like, if we show up in September and throughout the course of the summer, we see in the 480 number, we see another, it shows up and it's 4,900, and we've got 50 more kids than we were anticipating in kindergarten. We will at that point in time adjust so that those class sizes don't get out of control. Is that right?
Absolutely. We will adjust. It's frankly easier to adjust up if we have extra kids there. It means adding students adding staff at the last minute, which can be a little bit tricky, but it's something that our team has done and can do very easily.
Jim, if I could add to that, that was part of the reason we chose to reduce and not rehire those 11 positions. Those were all at elementary, and that's where our big reduction was. And so if we come out a little bit low, we made the right decision to not replace those 11 teachers. And if we come out higher than we thought, then we can certainly add some back. So that was part of our thinking on reducing those 11, if that makes sense.
So as you all know, and I think Gary mentioned it, we've built some buildings in the last few years and transformed some buildings. Very happy to say that we brought this project in within budget. We're currently in the kind of typical and expected warranty phase. In fact, I walked this afternoon for a few hours at the new high school with the architect and with the contractors to make sure that we identified any issues that needed to be resolved. We do have 2 areas of funding within the bond that will continue, and those are technology and curriculum. The bond, when it was passed, was designed to provide curriculum replacements for 10 years and technology replacements, the 1-to-1 for students, for 10 years also. And so those continue to have roughly between the 2 of them, it's about $7 million. And those will be expended over the next 7 years or so. And then in addition to the bond funds, we do have a fund set aside where there's about $370,000 that for curriculum and technology replacement. So once we reach the end of the bond money in 7 years, we are planning now to make sure that we can extend those programs further. We'll increase that by about $50,000 this year and continue to do so and look at that number each year. Pat.
Do we have a deferred maintenance? I
I'm
know we're keeping track of deferred maintenance. Do we have any funds allocated to deferred maintenance?
Phil, do you have that number offhand? I think we have 50,000 is what we've typically done.
Okay.
We caught up with a lot of it,
Right.
and we are in fact tracking our deferred maintenance. So we know if we need roofs, we're trying to pre-plan for some of those kinds of things. So.
Thank you.
And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Just one more for clarity, and this was clear back when we were talking about the Student Investment Act investments. One is in an associate principal at the Ridges, and that is a new position as associate principal. But that need, I just want to clarify again, just for the record here, that's a need that we have been sort of trying to fill in a not comprehensive way, in an inefficient way, through a teacher on special assignment, trying to fill portions of that role. This will allow us to properly fill that role as it was designed and intended, and consistent with how other districts deal with elementary schools of this size. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Okay. If there's no other questions, then I will move us on to the actual budget document, which sits in front of you. And I'm going to go through a little bit slide by slide, hitting some highlights. The format and level of detail that you have in front of you is prescribed by Oregon budget law. And so there are 4 funds that are used: the general fund, which accounts for general operating activities of the district, and any activities not required to be in another fund; the special revenue fund, which accounts for activities in which the revenues received are restricted, either internally or externally, for specific purposes; the debt service fund accounts for payments on the district's general obligation bonds and its pension bonds; and then the capital improvement fund, which accounts for the acquisition and construction of capital assets. And these are, if you're looking at page 1, you can start looking at where these, where you'll see these show up. This page 1 is a very high-level snapshot of the budget document. More detail will be presented on the following pages, and we're going to address significant changes as we move forward. Some observations that we'll discuss in greater detail include that the general fund decreased slightly, the special revenue fund continues to increase, and then the capital projects fund has dropped dramatically again now that we've completed our construction. Page 2. This page disaggregates the totals presented on the first page into the functional areas required by local budget law for each fund. Those include instruction, which are expenditures related to the delivery of instruction to students; support services, which are expenditures which support students; special education service, for example, as well as operations and maintenance operations; transportation and technology services. Community services includes our nutritional service program. Capital projects, again, are capital assets, construction or otherwise, with a life greater than 1 year. Transfers is the movement of resources from one fund to another. And then debt service is that payment of principal and interest due on the district's debt. And then contingency is an amount set aside that could not be determined how it would be spent when the budget is proposed, approved, or adopted, and requires kind of some special steps for the board to access those dollars if we need them at some point in the future during that one budget year. When the board adopts the budget, it will also make appropriations in the amounts in the functional areas for each fund, and these appropriations set limits for the amounts that can be expended. Contingency this year increased slightly due to the slowdown in spending on purchase services and materials, and in the special revenue fund for an additional set aside for that future textbook and technology replacement. I'm going to pause a little bit, see if anybody has questions.
I have one question. I think you may have just said it, but I was thinking about my question. I may have missed it. The 8.7 on the capital projects, with the buildings being done, what's included in that 8.7?
That is in part the 7 million left for technology and curriculum.
Okay.
And just one quick question, Jim. So the instruction increase from 43 to 44 and a half, was that just the extra teachers and stuff that we're hiring? And does that offset by the 11 positions that we're not filling?
The increase is in part due to roll-up costs for staff,
Okay.
COLAs and so forth.
Okay.
It is offset by those 11 positions.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to the general fund resources page on page 3. Our general fund this year is proposed at 59,312,000, or about 109,000 less than the current budget. And that's primarily due to increases in property taxes and our beginning fund balance, but being offset by a decrease in the basic school support. So the money we actually get from the state. The growth in our assessed value for property taxes for tax year 2021 exceeded 7%. And we are projecting that we will receive 18.1 million in property taxes for the current year. The estimate for next year was increased by 3% to 18.6 million, which is the amount permissible by law unless new additions to the property tax rolls are made. So we are limited to how much our property tax can go up that we will receive. So the basic school support is calculated using the state school fund allocation of 9.3 billion and the 4,859 students. Our ADMW, so this is our students, the way they do ADM is the straight number of kids that we have. ADMW adds a weight, and so students with different needs might have a different weight, up to a maximum weight of 2. Things like English as a second language, poverty, those kinds of things will increase the weight. Our ADMW number is 5,706, which is 231 less than the current year. We should get $8,800 per ADMW for 21-22. And so that's part of our reduction in that basic state schools support number. And the loss is offset slightly by an estimated increase in our reimbursement for transportation expenses. Our beginning fund balance is increasing a little over $500,000, and that's predominantly due to the work share savings that we had last spring. You may recall work share was a program from the state funded by the feds that allowed us to furlough staff 1 day a week, and the staff could choose to apply for unemployment, and the district receives savings. Most of the staff ended up ahead of it instead of if they just worked their full week. The idea was to avoid layoffs, which it did for us. That was a big chunk of savings for us that rolled into that ending fund balance for this year. Our local income consists of interest earned, fees charged to grants, and facility rentals. The jump from 1920 actual to 2021 and 21-22 budget results from the decision to bring the management of our facilities back in-house. So we chose to do that rental directly out of our facilities department rather than have an outside agency do it for us. And then the federal source budget of $138,000 in 2021 was an estimate of the kind of expected grant under the CARES Act. Those grant-related expenditures were ultimately accounted for in the special revenue fund.
So I just want to, again, not everyone can see these documents. Our number, our actual other local income in 1920 was $556,813. And by bringing things in-house, we have seen an increase to $836,182. Is that correct? And we attribute the vast majority of that, nearly $300,000, to making the decision to bring services over so that we run them and actually accrue the resources that we can then deploy into our own facilities. Is that right?
That's the big chunk of it, yes.
Thank you.
Actually, Phil, the 556 to 836 is probably much of that is the reimbursement for the overcharge from the city, correct? Okay.
Excuse me, that was taken directly into the special revenue fund and held as reserves. Yeah.
Okay. So then, yes, it is. I'll move us to page 4, which you've seen this information in the summary of funds on page 2, and so we won't spend a whole lot of time on that. I think it's actually probably more helpful to move on to page 5, but I'll pause just long enough to see if there's any questions. Okay. So the previous slide showed the general fund expenditures by the purpose for the expenditures, and then this slide considers the type of expenditure budgeted. Salaries have increased 532,000, and the significant drivers is the net change due to increases for steps and COLA that are provided in our collective bargaining agreement, less the estimated cost of the 11 positions that will not be filled. The decrease in employee benefits is driven by that reduction in PERS we mentioned earlier, a 3% decrease. The purchase services and materials and supplies were modified just a bit. They were increased substantially in the 2021 budget, roughly 637,000, and that was to provide costs for the new high school and transformation projects. So we kind of pre-planned that would happen, made those adjustments. They've been adjusted slightly in the 21-22 for ongoing estimated costs. Again, this is one place where you'll see that transfer for the textbook and technology replacement. All right, I'll move us on to page 6. As I mentioned before, this fund accounts for activities in which the revenues are restricted either internally or externally for specific purposes. So this includes local, federal, and state grants. It also contains certain district-operated programs such as nutritional services, bus replacement, athletic activities, and the construction excise tax collections. The increase in state and federal sources is due to the summer learning programs and the ESSER funds, both of which we discussed a bit earlier. The increase in transfers is, again, that amount for textbook and technology replacement. The next page, page 7, is some of that same data, but in graphical format. So I'll pause on that if there's any questions. Okay, I'll move us on to page 8. This is our debt services fund. And when our voters approved our general obligation bonds, they also approved the district may levy property taxes to pay those bonds off. We do have bonds that are outstanding that are not general obligation bonds, and those bonds are our pension bonds that we issued to deposit with PERS, and that provides us a rate credit against our imposed rates from PERS. And so the way that bond works is part of our money from the state is directly transferred to PERS or the bond paying agent. These amounts are labeled state pass-through, and they are often described as an intercept agreement. Page 9 is that same data in graphical format. And then page 10 is our capital projects fund. And these are activities associated with our 2016 bond election. There's also money in there for the Bowman House, which is our high school construction program. And that program is designed to construct and sell a house every couple of years. And the transfers in and out represent advances to the Bowman House. And once the house sells, the transfers are back. So it is intended to keep itself funded and moving forward. Outside of the Bowman House activities, all the activities in this fund are related to the 2016 bond. that's the end of the document. And again, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right. With no other questions, do we have any public testimony, any public comments?
We do not have any public testimony submitted.
All right. Well, then we are moving right along. Any discussion, deliberation? I think the best time for questions was during the presentation, so I think most of those got answered as we went along. I know a lot of mine got answered just as we were going, so. All right, yes.
Can I just make one quick comment? And that is just how exciting it is, all these investments we're going to be able to make for this year. I mean, I've been on the board for about 9 years, and I remember we were talking about it before the meeting, that my first board meeting, the room was a little fuller, and we just were kind of at the end of a economic downturn, and we were forced to make a lot of cuts. And in the last 9 years, I think the only other large investment we've been able to make is when we went to full day kindergarten when it was mandated by the state. So the fact that we were actually able to go through a almost 9-month long process, almost 18 months ago, and kind of find some things that work well for our students in our community is just so exciting. And the fact that we have that brand new high school all finished up, I was just kind of looking back, and I think Archer Glen opened up like 25 years ago. And for my time here in Sherwood, it seems like as soon as we opened up a new school, about 2 years later, we were starting to plan for the next school that we probably had to build. And we aren't having those discussions anymore. So I am just absolutely ecstatic for the place that we're in now, the investments we're able to make for our students. And one last, I want to give one last shout out to Phil before we go here, and just kind of say how much I appreciate all the work that he's kind of put into this. And when I talk to other board members at other districts, and I see how they kind of forecast out into the future, they do not have the insight that we have. I was just reading a thing today, how the PERS board is going to be getting together and making a decision that won't be implemented until like 2023 or something. But I know that we're going to be able to actually consider that into our budgets and see how those things look, 2-3 years out, which makes a huge difference, so that we can start these programs, keep these programs, and we aren't kind of doing the oscillating that a lot of other districts. I really appreciate all your work. So thanks.
Thank you, Eric. And I just want to echo that. Having had a little bit of involvement with the bond, this is not exactly the fall 2020 that we were planning on, but looking at what's ahead and all the exciting opportunities, there are bright things in the future for our kids. Just the opportunities that we have here are amazing. So I am really thankful for that. Any other questions, comments? Sue?
I just want to echo some of the same things, but just really, I'm also so thankful that for so many years, I think I've been on, budget committee for a while, or school board combination, but there's always been a very conservative, measured approach to how we handle the budget. And it's been sustainable for the most part. And I think that is so nice that we're not, as we've talked about, oscillating, but that it's just so thoughtful and so well done. And, it's just really appreciated that we don't have to, make cuts or do some of those last minute things that other districts may have to do. So thank you.
Any other discussion, questions, comments? All right, the next item on the agenda would be the action required, the motions.
Madam Chair, I move the Budget Committee approve the proposed budget for the 2021-2022 year as submitted by the superintendent with no changes, approved by the Budget Committee.
I'll second.
Okay, and so the motion to approve the budget has been moved and seconded. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, that motion carries.
Oh, come on. There you go.
Next on the agenda.
Madam Chair, I move to approve the 2021-2022 levy of the district's permanent rate of $4.8123 per $1,000 of assessed value and $15,111,120 for debt service.
I'll second.
All right, it has been moved and seconded to approve the levy. All those in favor, say aye.
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 All those opposed? All right, motion carried. All right, thank you. Had a little bit of experience, but. So on our agenda, we have approved those motions. So that concludes this first part of the budget committee. So the second budget committee meeting is not needed. That was scheduled for tomorrow evening. And so the next item would be the budget hearing at 5:30 p.m. in the district office. That will be the school board. And with that,